Hello, all. Welcome back. I am Charles Musgrove, your host of Business Matters. We're still in the COVID crisis. We're still doing remote broadcasting. We're still doing remote podcast. I'm in Miramar Beach. Our guest today is in Destin, Florida, and John is back at the studio in Tallahassee, Florida. Yes, we are coming to you from 3 locations. We're adapting to this technology. We're all learning something new. It's fun to do this. And I think we're improving our skill set. We can do setups for remote broadcasting, podcasting, but we're still bringing you nuggets of knowledge. And today we have with us in the house, Mark Bonfanti. Mark, thank you so much for joining us on Business Matters.
I appreciate that, Charles. It's great to be here, broadcasting live from our own home studio. So hopefully there won't be any unintended special guests on my end.
I hear you. I had to lock off the dog door so the dogs didn't go in and out. So, Mark, this is the pre-roll before we start recording for the radio show, and we'll set up our show. We'll kind of go through in general what the topics are that we're going to discuss, and then we'll do a deep dive into them when we go through the show. Now, the show recording is only 26 minutes, so just remember that as we go through that. You'll hear a little intro once we get started, and then at the end of the show, John will play us from the studio a little outro that'll kind of warn us to end the conversation that we're in. So that's kind of how that'll set up. And for those of you that are watching and listening, we are on YouTube. So check out our YouTube channel. Look for Bean Team. Look for Business Matters. You'll see a lot of shows that we've got recorded there in the past where we provide good information about how to run your business. We got a lot of shows on the different things that we've had to deal with in this COVID crisis. We've got stuff on the PPP loan application, the funding of that. We discuss other loan options that have been made available through the government, through the state, through the banks as a result of this COVID shutdown. So check out our YouTube. We're also on Apple Podcast and iHeartRadio, so check us out there. Business Matters is what to look for. And today, Mark, we've got a lot of changes in the laws and regulations related to employment law. And your expertise, you're a subject matter expert in the employment law area. So give us a little bit of background on the things that you've had to deal with specifically related to this COVID crisis that we're in right now.
Sure. Right now, initially we had to deal with a lot of the unknowns, and a lot of our clients, we typically represent only employers across the state of Florida and the state of Georgia, really the Southeast in general. And a lot of question marks as the new COVID legislation was coming out. And employers were concerned about their own business, obviously, as the pandemic swept the nation, and wanted to know what was going to be happening to their workforce. We had to, guide our clients through whether or not layoffs or furloughs would be appropriate for their workforce. A lot of questions came up regarding unemployment compensation. And as the legislation was, approved by Congress, we were answering questions initially on Family Medical Leave Act issues as they came up, and that quickly shifted gears more into what do we do with employees, because we want to qualify for the different loan programs and grant programs that are available to us from the government. And so we had to guide our clients through those different processes and work with accounting firms and make sure that they were taken care of.
Yeah, we've had, it's been the same issue that the FMLA law change came out before the CARES Act came out, and that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that really put an additional requirement or more requirements on the employer, and it really didn't provide a funding mechanism for that. It just provided for how to deal with the employees and how to compensate them or cover them if they were out ill with COVID.
It's exactly right.
So then we had the CARES Act was put into law probably 2 weeks after the changes in the FMLA law, and then that the PPP or the Paycheck Protection Program, as the CARES Act became known, really provided a funding mechanism or a way for those businesses to have the funds, the paycheck money to pay those employees, either to reemploy them or keep them employed, and even cover them if they were out sick with COVID related matters. Is that
Exactly right?
That's a true generalization of that.
Absolutely.
So now that the Paycheck Protection Program money has been funded, or a lot of our clients that they've started to receive the money, and you see that across the nation where that money went out through the SBA, through the lenders and to the borrowers. So now that they've received that, now they're tackling the other problem in how to qualify for the loan forgiveness feature of the PPP. So that's going to involve either rehiring people or keeping people hired. So a lot of the restaurants and the bars, unfortunately, they've been funded now, but they don't have the all clear to open their business back up. So they're in a dilemma to try to crystal ball when they will be able to open, what the opening looks like. Will it be a staged opening? Will they be able to only have 50% capacity? So now they have to deal with those business issues as well as reemploying their work staff that they had furloughed. So there's a lot of business issues there. There's a lot of strategy involved. There's a lot of crystal balling or guessing or making the best assumptions you can with the information you have today. So that creates a lot of crossover of business funding and employment law issues.
Exactly. And you mentioned in the hospitality industry that's kind of phased in of the reopening of the businesses. And I even saw an article and a release actually just went out a couple hours ago here in Okaloosa County, Florida. And they're talking about already having a county commission meeting and a 3-tiered approach to rolling out how they're going to end up reopening public areas, beaches, and then rolling into it, partial openings of restaurants, and then finally moving to phase 3, which will be a full opening. But there's no timetable there yet. And I imagine it's going to be the same around the state as different counties tackle these issues.
Yeah, it's I think from the executive level and the federal level, president staff, they've really put that down to the state level to make those decisions on how they're going to reopen business, and to some extent, it's probably going to be pushed down on a community basis as well. The state may provide some broad guidelines to work under, and then it's going to be left to the individual counties or even communities to make those decisions on how they reopen the business, reopen the economy.
Absolutely. And they're going to have to take, individual kind of pressure points into consideration when they move through those decision making processes, only because you've got different industries in all areas of the state. And so it really is going to come down to those individual municipalities to make those difficult decisions,
right?
Balancing the risks for each.
Yeah. So then that's pushed down to the individual companies and how they deal with their own employment issue, their employees. And, I saw several commentaries on this where the feds have made the unemployment part of the paycheck protection program so good to take care of those unemployed people that in some cases they may get paid more to be unemployed than they are to be reemployed where they were before. So a lot of the clients that we have, they're looking at the fact that they may get pushback from some of those furloughed employees that they're making more money on unemployment than they are if they come back to work. So, the questions we get from that are, what do they do? What does the employer do? Is that considered that they've just quit, that they've resigned? And if they've resigned under their own volition, then they're not eligible for unemployment, at least under the old rules.
Right. That's exactly it. And so employers are going to have some difficult decisions to be making and some issues they'll have to navigate as they do reopen their doors and as they try to restaff up. We're already fielding questions exactly of that kind, asking what happens to the employer, what will happen to the employee. Unfortunately, there are a lot of employees, I think, across the country and our state that are going to opt for staying on unemployment if they can, in order to make what they perceive as more money. In some cases, it just might be that. But there are some hurdles to getting that money and some problems that employers have been facing and employees too.
Yeah, that just complicates the difficulty with the employer that received that Paycheck Protection Program money, and they have to meet certain criteria in order to have their loans forgiven. So that in addition to the guesswork that they're having to go through on when they can reopen, how much of capacity can they reopen, what does business look like? Those are all in the future estimates that they have to make. So layered on top of that is now another difficulty with rehiring employees, and some of those employees may not want to come back to work. So now, what does their pool of workers look like that are available to come back? So just a lot of challenges for those particularly in the hospitality industry, those restaurants and bars that were shut down, the hotels that closed. So that's going to present a special problem, especially in Okaloosa County and Walton County and a lot of the other areas in the state of Florida and across the United States that are tourism driven, that are entertainment, that have large gatherings, or restaurants and bars. Those are going to be areas that have already been particularly hit, and just reopening of those are going to be a challenge.
Absolutely. And over here, where I'm currently sitting in the Destin area, there's a lot of that already happening, and people are making some difficult choices. And I've seen some businesses have already said that, they don't think they're going to be actually reopening their doors, while others are just chomping at the bit to get employees back and actually get back in the business that they love so much. So hopefully we'll see that happening here in the next few weeks.
Well, good. Let's in the show, let's also touch on some other topics in this same area, such as is there the new FMLA policies? Are there any type of limitations? Is it all businesses that are 500 or more, or is there a 50 employee exclusion that those companies with 50 or more employees, some of this may not apply? How does managing the culture of the workforce look? And I know that's not necessarily a rule or a law that's written, but definitely when you're managing people from remote locations and they're not all gathered together, it makes that much more of a challenge. Some of the other issues with managing a remote workforce are, how do you monitor what they're doing? Are the wage and hour issues still applicable? You may not necessarily have a time clock that people can punch into that they may have had in a workplace setting before. So all of those create more variables, and when variables are presented, there's probably more opportunity for abusing the situation and lawsuits to arise from either the employee side or the employer side, but it creates potential for conflict between the employer and the employee.
Absolutely. And I think that, when you start getting into these remote work situations for employers that maybe historically have not had their workforce, working off site or working from home off different hours, they absolutely can be faced with different legal issues that will arise. And we anticipate that there will be an uptick in different types of litigation involving wage and hour law and the FMLA leave as employers reopen and the employees come back to work.
Well, good. And I think what I'd like to do is just kind of leave it open to you for the FMLA issues that you've already seen happen with this change, or what are most likely some of the things that are going to come up that as a result of that law change.
Sure. Yeah, no, we've been getting questions whether or not, who qualifies. You touched upon it earlier, this exemption, the 50 employees, is that a threshold where they actually have some rules that don't apply to them, and potential for relief under this law? We've been getting a few questions on that, as well as how do you calculate the leave? What amounts, are there limitations on the amounts that these individuals can get, whether or not you have to allow them, the individual employees, to use different types of leave in order to actually be out from work. And so we're trying to help our clients navigate through those issues.
Yeah, I think those are really those are relevant. Those are things that employers are going to deal with right now, as well as the employees. And if the employers do not do that correctly, then my guess is they're going to be subject to potential litigation with that as well. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So the employers want to make sure they understand it, even though it's new and complex. They need to understand it and to execute it correctly.
Precisely. Otherwise, they'll be hearing from your local plaintiff lawyer, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, good. I think we've got more than enough for the show. So we'll just leave it open. We'll just have if things pop in your head that you think are relevant to discuss, then let's bring those up, and we'll just provide some good information for what people need to look for in the employment law issues. As all things COVID are on the table. So let's kick off the show. John, play us a little music, and we'll get started for the recording of the radio show.
Welcome to the Business Matters Talk Show with Charles Musgrove. On Business Matters, we discuss the issues that matter to your business. Find more episodes on Apple Podcast, YouTube, and beanteam.com. And now here's your host, Charles Musgrove.
Thanks for having me, Charles.
It's going to be a great show.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking through some of these issues with you.
We got a lot of issues. I want to set this show up, but the first thing that we failed to do in our pre-show is to state the day we're doing this and the time we're doing it. You know, before this COVID crisis, it wasn't a big issue not to mention the day and the time, but as this COVID crisis has hit us, the day and the time that we have these discussions is relevant because things have changed so rapidly and so dramatically in a short period of time. So today is April the 20th. It is 3:36 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So Mark and I are over in Central Time. John is in the studio back in Tallahassee on Eastern Time. So who knows what we're going to look at next. The next time we listen to the show, later in the week, things are going to be different. Right now, we're looking at funding has run out totally on the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program. That was initially at $350 or $360 billion. They have gone through that rapidly within a 2-week period of time. And now they could be on the Senate floor right now trying to argue and petition for another $250 billion to be put into that program. So that'll raise that up to $600 billion that they put through that program in a short period of time. So, Mark, I did say that correctly. It is billions and not trillions, right?
Correct.
I saw something today. It was an interesting stat on how that money has been used. And over 70%, this is quantity, not dollar-wise, but over 70% of the loans processed through that Paycheck Protection Program, I believe the number was loans less than $150,000. So the vast majority of that money, just at the number of loans that have been processed, were to what you would qualify or consider as small business. Those in the multi-million dollars they consumed a lot of the money, but as far as number of loans processed, they were the minority, very low percentage of the total loans that were processed. So that money went out to the small business, and that is the heartbeat of America is the small business entrepreneurs out there. Those are the clients that Bean Team serves, and I know those are the clients that you work with as well, Mark. So it's good to hear that, and it's good to I think see that Congress is working to get more money through that Paycheck Protection Program. I think that's a good way to get the economy back up, to keep people employed, to hopefully keep people off the unemployment lines as much as possible. We've already taken a big hit with the unemployment numbers. We saw approaching 20 million people have been unemployed during this period of time. So that is a staggering number of people when you're looking at. Prior to COVID, we were at around 200,000. So that's a dramatic change in the unemployed people out there in America. So we want to get things back up and running and minimize any negative effects that we know that's going to have, not just with the economy, but with people's health as well. That has a devastating effect on people when they can't work and they're faced with financial struggles. So that kind of sets that up, puts it in context. And Mark is an employment law specialist. He has some nuggets of knowledge that he's going to bring to us today on the employment side. So Mark, thank you for joining us. I know you've done several Zoom calls with our clients, and you've provided a lot of good information on the employment law matters, especially this change in the FMLA law that's come about as the result of the COVID crisis. So thank you for being our guest today on the podcast. I think you're going to be able to really provide some good insight, some good information for our clients and for all those that are watching and listening to the podcast. So thank you. And let's just kick it off with the FMLA issues. And I want to let you kind of tell us what you see are the main issues that have changed with the way the FMLA law worked before and after this COVID crisis.
Sure. And, Charles, thank you so much for having me. And, our firm, Hall, Gilligan, Robertson, Shanlever, practices throughout Florida, the Southeast. We have offices up in Atlanta and the Seacoast as well. And we deal with small employers and large employers, and made the point earlier about the dollars that went out. It was refreshing in a sense to see a large amount of the money go to small businesses, which is the bulk of the clients that I represent. And it was also interesting to see this afternoon. I saw some articles and releases on larger national chains that might have gotten a piece of that money before it ran out. But there's some, whether it was public pushback that is making them do it, or they're just realizing that the program ran out of money a lot faster than everybody anticipated, but they'll be turning their dollars back into the government. And so our hope is that some of those clients and small businesses that maybe didn't get in time will end up receiving an approval of those loans. As I've already seen, a $10 million was given back, and so hopefully there'll be more of those if they did in fact happen like that. So it's something for small businesses to at least not lose hope over at this point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. We had clients that they had made their application, but they were notified by the bank that they just ran out of time. They didn't get it in under the wire, and the money ran out before it could be processed. So the way that worked was the banks, after the borrower submitted their application to the banks then submitted it to the SBA, who then approved it. Once the SBA approved that funding for that specific borrower, they would set aside, or they would allocate funds for that loan, and they would notify the bank. Then the bank would notify the borrower. So the borrowers knew pretty quickly if they had been allocated funds or not. So we did have clients that received the dreadful communication that they just didn't get their loan processed in time and they ran out of money. So the banks that I saw those communications on, they were hopeful that there would be additional funding to the program, and that they would, those clients that missed it, that had their application in, they would be first in line to be processed in the second round. So that is the hope, and I truly believe that's going to happen. And it's just a matter of time. Hopefully that'll all happen this week. That additional money will go in, and the process is already set up. So really there's not a lot of startup pain or restart pain that's going to happen. They should be able to process those pretty quickly.
That's the hope. On the FMLA front, when March 18th, when the Senate passed their revised version of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, it extended out those FMLA benefits to small businesses with fewer than 50 employees. And so, as many of the employers out there that are below 50, they realized quickly that this is interesting. Now they're subject to this law, and that they're going to have to be providing some type of sick leave, paid sick leave, to employees that are impacted by the coronavirus. And while it does sunset at the end of the year, there's still many questions that came up, and employers wanted to know, well, how does this apply to me, and what amounts? And so pursuant to that act, they need to provide full-time employees with 80 hours of emergency paid sick leave, and part-time employees with a ratio, essentially the average number of work hours that they worked in a 2-week period for an emergency paid sick leave type of fund if they can't work or telework. And so that, I think that's a key distinction. And so the employee needs to be essentially not incapacitated, but unable to work from home or work via Skype or some other method in order to fulfill the duties of their job. And if that's the case, then and they're out because of COVID, or they were told by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine due to concerns related to COVID, whether they're experiencing symptoms of COVID or they're caring for another individual that's subject to a quarantine, or caring for their child, then they would basically be eligible for this sick leave time. And so
that's the employee that is. So if they're in a normal office setting and they're able to work from home, so their job allows them to do that, but yet they are incapacitated because they have some COVID-related illness, or their physician has said you need to self-quarantine, or they're taking care of someone, then assuming they're a full-time employee, they're required to receive under this law 80 hours of paid leave.
That is correct.
How does if you're a bar or a restaurant and your employer has furloughed you, then that situation would not exist. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so if you are currently furloughed, or laid off, even these requirements wouldn't necessarily be an issue, which is why we believe that it's more important than even when this law was passed and released. It's very important for employers to understand the requirements of this act, because we're now drawing closer and closer to when these employers will start to reopen. And right. We think that there will be a significant number of individuals that end up requiring this type of leave or requesting this type of leave, or at least the possibility exists. Here, while employers have been shut down, it's largely been inapplicable. But now we're starting to get calls trickling in saying, well, when I bring my workforce back, what happens if someone calls out sick, or do we have to give them paid leave immediately? And what if they have to take it for some other reason, or there are just general exemptions for employers, if they have less than 50 employees.
So the 50 employee exemption is not in effect for this.
Well, I mean, it is in effect, but it hasn't been coming into play just while so many places have been closed.
Okay, so if you're an employer that is, and you laid people off or furloughed them, and you're
right.
And you're less than, and the employee size is less than 50, so you fall under that threshold, and an employee can't work because they have an employee that you bring back on the workforce. If they have a COVID related illness, they can claim the 80 hours of sick.
They can claim it when they come back, assuming the workforce is back and they're no longer being furloughed. Of course, then there's these other exemptions that need to be considered. So if it's a small business with less than 50 and they're saying, well, maybe we are going to be, we're exempt, we don't have to provide that benefit, and the use of that paid leave, for instance, is for the care of a child. And this is a big issue right now that Florida has announced that schools will remain closed for the remainder of the academic year. They're saying, well, there's some exemptions here. And so the Department of Labor clarified that. And they said, look, if in order to be eligible for that exemption, it must be determined that the leave requested under this act, or under the child care provision of the sick leave requirements, would result in the small business's expenses and financial obligations exceeding their revenues. And essentially, and so it's a high bar to meet, is caused the small business to cease operating at a minimal capacity. Wow, that's a very high bar. It's a very high bar. And that the absence of the employee requesting leave would entail some sort of substantial risk. And I think this goes without saying, I guess, if you're going to have to cease operating at a minimal capacity, but that it would entail substantial risk to the financial health of the business and the operational capabilities. Or there are simply not sufficient workers who are able and willing and qualified available in order to provide those services that they're looking for. And so, in order to reach those minimum staffing capacities really that they have to have in order to operate their business, which,
Wow. So that really gives the leg up to the employee.
it absolutely does.
Plus, until they have more universal testing, it's fairly easy for the employee to say they need to be out because they believe they have a COVID related illness. So, they're really not until the testing is more readily available. They're not forcing people to go get tested. They're just saying, if you think you got it, just self quarantine.
Absolutely. And I think that's this 50 employee threshold for the exemption, I think, is going to cause even more confusion. I wouldn't be surprised if the Department of Labor issues additional clarifications on it, and potentially even looks somewhat to revise the requirements of it, because you are going to have, I believe, a lot of small employers that they get this request from an employee and they say, well, we're less than 50 and we believe we're going to be exempt, and they'll try to get the exemption, but there's a strong likelihood that they won't be able to get that exemption. And so if your business does feel like it does qualify, it's very important to document all of those qualifications, maintain sufficient records that you can essentially prove that this is why you would be exempt from that requirement.
Wow, that's a real challenge to the employer. So really, the PPP program did not necessarily provide funds to cover those issues. It just says that if you're paying employees because of, as required under the FMLA requirement for COVID-related illnesses, you can count that money as part of the calculation for the loan forgiveness.
Right. And if you're doing the, if you have to pay out under this family medical leave emergency bill, they receive the tax credit, a payroll tax credit of 100% of the emergency family leave wages that they pay pursuant to that act.
Okay. So the wages are a credit for payroll taxes.
Correct.
Okay. So that is a pretty big benefit.
It is.
If you're able, if you pay people because of COVID related illness under this act, then again, this is going to go to proper documentation. So keep the documentation that they're ill, and then your accounting records need to reflect that particular pay that they received was for them being out ill with the COVID virus. And then you get a full credit for payroll taxes. So it's the taxes that you would typically pay for the employer taxes for 941. Is there a credit for the employee side of that, or is it just the employer portion of the payroll taxes?
It's the employer side.
Okay.
And so
that's a big deal. And that's going to go back to, as I always get from Mark and other employment lawyers, they're always going to say documentation is the key to your defense and the position that you take.
That's right. And there are limitations in terms of the amounts and timing of this as well that employers should keep in mind. And so if somebody does try to take paid leave under this section, the employer is not required during the first 10 days of that leave to provide paid leave. And during that time, so it creates somewhat of a buffer. And during that time, employees are permitted to substitute in their vacation or personal, other types of sick leave maybe they have, in order to get compensated if that's available to them. And then if the leave is required beyond that 10 days, then the employers must pay for each additional day of that leave. And in order for that calculation, they look at the wages of that employee, and it's 2/3 of the employee's regular rate of pay. And so they would, make that calculation, and then it's capped at $200 per day or $10,000 in total.
Okay, so that doesn't kick in until they've been out for 10 days. So the employee's kind of left in limbo, or this gap, if they don't have vacation for that first 10 days or 2 weeks worth of pay.
Exactly.
Okay, good to know. All right, those are important points of that. Anything else with the FMLA? Does it address the remote work environment or anything like that?
With respect to the remote working environment, that was the teleworking. And so if the employee is unable to work for the telework, work from home, then they would be eligible for this leave,
Okay.
assuming it's a COVID type of related absence that they would have.
Let's address the. I've gotten several calls or questions of this. I guess some of the restaurant owners that have reduced their work size during this time period, that they either have had this issue or they envision having the issue where the employee may want to continue to receive unemployment benefits rather than be reemployed, that they're going to make as much or more money from their unemployment compensation they get through the state fund than they will as an employee. What kind of issues does that create on the employer?
Sure. No, it is definitely a concern for employers. And just before we do jump into that, I just wanted to mention as well that when employers are looking what they would have to pay under the family medical leave portion, it's really important that they're also documenting the reason for the leave. And so whether the employee is taking leave for their own condition, or if they're taking leave for the care of another individual, like a child, right. Because there are different requirements and caps for the payments. And it would take up too much time today to go through all of that. But it's very important to know which path they're going down in terms of the leave and who it's for and what the purpose of that leave is, in order to determine when that period of time would kick in and the amounts that they would be paying. And so every situation really needs to be looked at very closely by employers as they make that determination.
Good. Those are good points to make sure that we bring up. What I would like to do is, Mark, if you've got any documentation or any checklist or anything like that, I'd like to put that in our show notes and in the description to the show that we put both on our podcast as well as on YouTube. So people can go to that as a reference point. They can get more information. Anything else that you think we want to pass on to those that are listening, let's put that in our description on that we provide on the show.
Sure, I'm happy to do that, and we'll make sure we include the leave as well as the unemployment questions. And to your unemployment question, it's very very important for employers to understand, and employees too, because the requirements of getting unemployment or reemployment compensation in Florida can be confusing, I think, to individuals. And because of the way that the amounts are calculated under the program, where there's the federal supplement, you have, especially in the hospitality industry, as well as others, employees that look at the amount of money they would be making and say, well, I'd actually make more to stay at home. I don't want to come back to work. And that employee could be correct. That might be the case. For employers, however, I would, caution them to just letting the employee stay out. And some employers, they, big hearts, they say, well, we want the employee to make the most they can, so we'll let them stay out as opposed to coming back to work. But then they could put their, if they did apply for other relief, put those funds in jeopardy if they're not bringing back at least 75% of their workforce.
Right. So that creates the dilemma that the employer has when they're trying to meet this 75% threshold, and it's based on compensation. Two layers of the compensation. One is dollar amount and one is the employee count. So really both of those are relevant, and they're important in order to receive that loan forgiveness. So that's going to be a big issue. So what happens to the employer, and Mark, we're running out of time, so we don't want to go too long on this, but the employee that says, hey, I'm going to stay unemployed, I'm going to collect my unemployment benefits from the state, at that point, that employee would be considered, they just quit, or they've resigned their position. Therefore, once you resign or you quit, you're not eligible for unemployment benefits. Is that correct?
That's correct. If you make an offer to return to work to an employer and the employee does not return, then in Florida, it's the employer would mark that down as voluntary separation. They quit, and they should be ineligible for those benefits. Now, whether the state, how the state really enforces that remains to be seen. But from an employer standpoint, it's important to document that offer to return to work and to document that employee's refusal to return. That way you're not putting yourself in jeopardy with receiving those funds.
Right. So now, then what happens, the employer's responsibility, when they get notified from the state that someone's applying for, they've got a claim for unemployment, then it's the employer's responsibility to contest that or to say, hey, here's the documentation that this person was offered a position and they didn't want to keep it. They didn't want to retain it.
Exactly.
All right, Mark, we have, it seems like we've got a lot more to discuss, but we've run out of time for the radio show. So with that being said, I want to, we're going to do a little add-on to the end of this show. So those that are listening on the podcast, you'll get the benefit of this, and those that are on YouTube, on the radio show that are listening from the radio show, go pick us up on YouTube or podcast. Mark Bonfanti, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's continue this good information. So thank you for joining us on Business Matters. You've been watching and listening to Business Matters. I'm your host, Charles Musgrove. Check us out every week, Sunday at 11:30 a.m. Real Talk 93.3 out of Tallahassee, Florida. YouTube, iHeart, Apple Podcasts. You got it all right there. Have a great day. Have a great week. Peace.
Show with Charles Musgrove is sponsored by the Bean Team. For all your business accounting and tax preparation needs, visit beanteam.com or call 893-7710. You can listen to more episodes of Business Matters on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or visit beanteam.com.
All right, that was great, Mark. Let's. I want to hit a couple of other things that we show on, or that we talk about, and so we hit on the unemployment. So the employer, they basically contest that unemployment claim. So then the employee is left out. So they don't have a job because they quit, and they don't get unemployment. So that's really the way the system should work. That should deter people from staying out of work when there's work available to do.
Right. Exactly. And quite honestly, I know things are supposed to be getting better, and I haven't checked the system recently, but with the delays and the problems that the state has had in processing the number of claims for unemployment, and there's potential for delays in benefits there. And so, really it's to an employee's benefit if their employer calls and says that, they're able to return to work. It's really to their benefit to continue working and to return back to work as opposed to not.
Yeah, I'm hoping that's the exception, and that really is those are the outliers that don't rejoin the workforce when the opportunity presents itself.
I think so. I think that I think that a lot of employees realize and recognize the problems that this has been causing for everybody, not just employers but everyone. And so I think that everyone's trying to pitch in and do what they can to get things back on track. And it's my hope as well that when the phone calls are being made, that people are ready to go back to work.
Absolutely. Let's hit on this is one of the topics that we brought up in the pre-show, and it is I think a lot of the service type businesses, a lot of the businesses that are able to have have their workforce work remotely, they're going to be dealing with new issues, and whether that's wage and hour, how do they track the number of hours that employees are working? How do they monitor that? Because before, if you're working in an office setting, it's a lot easier to monitor when people show up, when they leave, how productive they are, without necessarily having a time clock that people punch. But even in a lot of cases, that's there, and that situation may not be available in this remote work setting environment that we have now. So what are the issues that you see coming up with that, and how does the employer combat that or mitigate that risk?
Sure. The greatest risk, I think, is going to be those hourly employees that all of a sudden are working at home that traditionally do not do that. And so employers need to be mindful that hours will need to be tracked. I think that they really should revisit their hourly or any type of wage and hour policy that they have regarding overtime. And ensure that if overtime is not permitted, that they clearly state it is not permitted. Also put some type of system in place to track hours that employees work. Now you can work with your payroll company if you don't have some sort of system where people can log in, remotely to log into a time clock. Maybe they can get that added for them. At the most basic level, they can have timesheets filled out or emailed to the supervisors and have the supervisors approve the time that's being worked by those employees. Make sure employees know that they're not to be working off the clock, meaning that they cannot be taking an email or answering a question or doing anything like that if it is outside of the normal hours that they would be working. If that is discovered, it's important that employers know that they'll have to pay those employees for the hours that they worked. However, the employee can be disciplined for disobeying or ignoring that policy of the employer. What we don't want to see happen is employers face a situation where an employee may be worked off the clock without authorization, and then that employer tries to deduct that time either from the time card or the paycheck, however you want to, where that deduction comes from. But they cannot do that. You have to pay that employee for time worked, and then you can manage that employee on the policy side of things. I think that it's really important for employers, if they have employees that don't typically engage in this. Strong management is going to be more important now than ever, and they'll have to keep an eye on the workforce and remind people that they're to not be working off the clock, documenting the hours that they in fact are working. It's important to let your employees know that they should, if they're going to be writing down the times on timesheets, that they're not just simply saying, well, I work 9 to 5, so I'm just going to put 9 to 5. No, they need to put down the time that they started working and any breaks that they took and the time that they stopped working at the end of the day, and then provide that information to the employer so the employer can maintain that. What we don't want to see happen is, and I think that we will see an uptick in wage and hour type lawsuits of individuals claiming they worked off the clock and provide lots of timesheets over a great time period. And then the employer says, well, we didn't know that. Definitely put a system in place to approve timesheets on a regular basis, I recommend daily, especially in this day and age when people are home and they're not typically doing that. At a minimal, on a weekly basis, approve timesheets. That way everyone understands how many hours they're getting paid for and whether or not there are policies that are being violated.
Yeah, it goes back to the basics, and it's another situation where documentation is important to have the right policies and procedures in place, and then make sure that people are following those. And this may be a time that there should be adjustments to or refinement in the policies and procedures that you have for your organization.
Absolutely. It's a great time to really review all of your leave policies and your overtime policies and get, retrain employees as they're brought back. If they were, laid off or furloughed or, they're just really, even if they've been continuing to work, but all of a sudden now you have to shift to some sort of off-site work program, make sure you retrain all the employees on the available procedures that you have. That way everyone's on the same page.
Right. And you can provide a little bit of fear into those that are watching and listening. And the wage and hour audit is one of the worst audits that a company can go through. It's probably worse than a IRS audit, worse than a DOR audit. And it can just be hateful.
Absolutely. They'll come in and, they want to see pretty much everything that you have, and it's not something that any employer is going to want to go through. I can only imagine that DOL, depending on where you are in the level of the government, there might be a little bit of leeway that's given. But I think that if DOL gets after this, once employers reopen, they're really going to be looking for compliance on all levels, and it's really important that employers have their records in check and are ready.
Yeah, and it does make it harder that with the remote work situation that we're in now, just to manage the people is there's new challenges in that. So that's going to make it very, very interesting to see how the companies adjust to that and to make sure that they do. So it's an opportunity for abuse. At the same time, it's an opportunity to true up how your policies and procedures are set up and to make sure that people are in compliance with those.
Absolutely.
So, what do you have? And this is not really an issue with a policy or procedure or anything legal, but we're going to have the management of a business's culture. So that also is going to change dramatically with with the remote work setting. So now you have people that are working in their homes or working in different locations, and they're not showing up for an office. So it makes it more difficult or more challenging to manage the business culture or that office culture.
It is, and we've seen different types of, whether it's a Zoom call for different individuals that are now, instead of coming to a common office space, that they're all spread out at their houses, and their Zoom happy hours and different types of activities that people are trying to do in order to keep that culture going, keep a positive culture. They have to keep your workforce engaged. I've seen some, they're doing meet and greets between, employees and saying, hey, schedule a Zoom call with a coworker and welcome the dog into the frame. Welcome,
right.
The kids. Learn something about your coworkers that you maybe at the office you wouldn't necessarily see. And so, it's really important to try to keep those employees interactive with one another.
Good. What are there any, and this may be me just playing devil's advocate, but on the legal side, what are we looking at from additional risk or liability exposure with the workforce being remote? You don't have as much control over the workforce. They may be on work hours, so they may be exposed to things that they wouldn't ordinarily be exposed to, and creating more exposure for the business.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, there's, we have concerns when employees, especially, back pre-COVID, when people would say, hey, can we work from home? We would say, well, there's some pitfalls and, common occurrences that happen, whether it's wage theft, by employees saying they were working when they weren't working. If it was excess overtime, which, can lead to other problems for you. Even if it's just overtime in general. And then you get into these situations where employees say that they're owed money, that, they really didn't work, but there's no way to prove it because they wrote it down. And so now you're on the hook for get the wage and hour audits rolling. If they start to call DOL and say they're not properly paid, you're also, potentially it's just kind of a new arena for employers, but what kind of treatment can those employees be subjected to if they're contacting clients of yours now over FaceTime or some sort of video chat? And if they're harassed or being harassed potentially by another employee now that they're not together in the workforce at an office, let's say, where maybe somebody, a potential harasser, would not engage in that activity because there's witnesses around and other people are there. But now they're at home and they're taking a video chat from somebody. It's quite possible to be harassed or discriminated against, even over a video chat. And now as a manager and a supervisor or the employer, it's very difficult to keep an eye on that situation. And so I think that in your policies, depending on the position that the individual has, whether there's restrictions on having video conferences, that are non-business related with coworkers, and even just revisiting your reporting policies to let all the employees know, look, if you feel uncomfortable, if something happens, please bring it to our attention immediately. It's very important that they do that because I think that it really is a whole new area where employers could be susceptible to these claims and they'll never know it happened because it's happening outside of the business, but over some sort of video chat.
Yeah. Mark, you never fail to put a sense of fear in me when there are when there's things that I wasn't even thinking about to be worried about. That's a whole another level right there. So you've expanded the work environment to people's homes, and now you've equipped them with the ability to have video meetings, and that just is if you can imagine it, then the possibility exists for abuse of that situation, and that can definitely, like you're saying, open the employer up to even more risk than they would under a normal circumstance with normal work hours and a normal work setting. So things to be cautious of, and I know the playbook and the policy and procedure manual is going to expand, and I know that your firm, as well as many other employment law firms, are going to be on this. This is going to be a new arena, expanded arena for you. So help us stay on the lookout for that. And we're going to have your information on how people can contact you in the show description. So, Mark, this has been some very good information, and thank you for providing the good information, the nuggets of knowledge, and even those that are kind of put a sense of fear into us to make sure that we do things right. It's there's no excuse for not knowing. You need to educate yourself. You need to upgrade your policies and procedures, and you need to adapt to the new work environment if that exists for your business.
That's right. Well, I appreciate you having me today, Charles. And we don't want the employers necessarily scared, but prepared. So we can help them address those issues ahead of time. That's why we're here.
I like that. Not scared, but prepared. That's the best way to conduct ourselves. But don't ignore things that have changed. Address them. Deal with them the best you can, and document, and you'll be prepared for whatever may happen to you in the future. If you've got a sound foundation of legal advice that you've taken and you've adhered to that, and you've got good documentation, then you'll be in a good position to defend your position. Thank you so much. I look forward to having you on future Business Matters. So that's where I'm signing off, and join us again.
The Business Matters Talk Show with Charles Musgrove is sponsored by the Bean Team. For all your business accounting and tax preparation needs, visit beanteam.com or call 893-7710. You can listen to more episodes of Business Matters on Apple Podcast, YouTube, or visit beanteam.com.